Okay, everyone. Hi. We're going to do a slightly different format for our lecture today. It's not going to be live, so I apologize for us not being able to ask any questions. But um, I just wanted to pick up sort of where we left off last class period. I just wanted to recap this one on the British Empire. We had been talking about um, the various wars that Britain and France had been engaged in. We talked about how the British basically demolished the French Empire in three wars in the early 18th century. And so the British Empire was left with new possessions in Canada, India, the Caribbean, um, and especially in North America. So French North America is pretty much gone. And that means pretty much all of Canada now is in British hands. And the British possess land all the way to the Mississippi River. That region, that central region of the Ohio River Valley, the Missouri River Valley, as it flows into the Mississippi, had all really been part of French North America. That's all gone now. And Britain takes the portion all the way to the Mississippi. The Spanish Empire controls things to the west of the Mississippi. This comes at huge cost to the British, both British and the French for that matter, but there's huge cost in terms of maintaining this new empire. The naval expenditures to maintain connections from Great Britain to the rest of its overseas possessions. Um, Defending these new North American territories against Native Americans, many of whom had been allied to the French during the French and Indian War. Those Native American tribes are still rather aggressive. They do not like the British. They do not like the American colonists. The relationship between American colonists and French colonists with the locals, the natives, was very different. French colonists tended to get along a lot better with the Native American tribes. American colonists very much not so. Um, and then finally, there is a question of how to now finance all that war debt. And that gets us into the idea of mercantilism, and we'll talk about what mercantilism is. Um, and I had said to one class already, the concept that had sort of run the British Empire in North America from, let's say, the 60s all the way down to the 1770s, or excuse me, the 1620s, from the foundation of British North America all the way down to the 1760s, was this idea of what historians call benign neglect. Essentially, the British let the American colonists do what they liked. A lot of the rules that were on the books for other parts of the British Empire weren't necessarily applied to North America rigorously. And they sort of let the American colonies flourish on their own, and it worked. This is sometimes called salutary neglect, or benign neglect is probably the more common term that's used now. Um, but and it was neglect is the sense that, not that they were treated badly, but the rules of economics that the British government had adopted that were essentially mercantilist were not applied to the North American colonies. And this is what mercantilism essentially says, right? These are policies that were pursued by many different governments around Europe in the 16 and 1700s. And mercantilism was, we could say, we are capitalists today. We often talk about the difference between capitalism and communism, and how communism is a state controlled economy where wealth is shared among all people and nobody really makes profit on things, and so on and so forth. Capitalism is free trade and free enterprise and the invisible hand of the markets and so forth. Mercantilism predates capitalism, and it was another form of kind of government controlled economy. The economic thinkers in the 16 and 1700s thought that economic expansion was fairly limited. You could not expand your own economy unless someone else's economy suffered as a result of it. Um, imagine it sort of as, everybody's kind of thirsty. There's 1 gallon jug of water, and everybody gets some in their own glasses. If somebody gets more, it's because somebody gets less. Right, so that was sort of the idea behind economic. They did not believe in a kind of ever expanding economy where new markets could be opened, new products could be developed, and wealth generated that way. Um, and the basis of a nation's measure of a nation's wealth was the amount of gold reserves that they had from taxation, from trade. The idea was to create, especially trade policy, where more money was flowing into your country than was flowing out. So that meant you wanted to keep your imports low and your exports high. You wanted to export much more in terms of sheer dollar value than you were actually importing. So there were policies that were implemented to ensure that this happened. That you always had a positive balance of trade. That's the term. More exports, fewer imports will generate a positive balance of trade. So these were sometimes called protectionist policies. It meant that within a country, the government would license certain monopolies, right? A company would be allowed to have a monopoly on, let's say, the lace industry or the winemaking industry or the salt production. Different commodities would be allowed to be monopolized by a single company or a single grouping of companies. And usually they would have been native companies. So if we use France as an example, would be the French lace companies were given a monopoly, and that was to exclude rival, cheaper, just as high quality lace coming in, let's say, from Belgium or the Netherlands. So that so that would help keep French people buying French produced lace as opposed to foreign produced lace, and would keep that money within the French economy, not being spent out to Belgium or to Spain or to Italy or wherever. Okay. That would be like us saying you can only buy a car from Ford Motor Company in America. You could only buy cars made in America. We're not sending our money to Germany or to Japan or to Korea or wherever. Excuse me. Another way of doing this is through tariffs. Tariffs raise a tax on foreign imports. So all of a sudden that German car becomes really, really expensive, or that Japanese car becomes really, really expensive. So it's much cheaper to buy the American car. Therefore, you're going to buy American. You're going to keep that wealth in the United States. Okay. Tolls, moving moving around your country. You have to, the infrastructure, the logistics, you have to pay money to do that. And of course, taxes are another way of keeping wealth in your country. Um, all of these things to a capitalist, later on in the late 1700s, to a capitalist, all of these things served one purpose, was just to limit economic growth. Right? You were putting too many strictures on the economy, and therefore it was not going to expand as much. But capitalists believe that economies can expand kind of um, exponentially, really, or at least linearly. There is no limit. There's no ceiling to growth. Mercantilists are very much about preserving wealth in one's own country. Another way to do this is to, if you don't have resources that you might have to, let's say, import from another country, what you do is you go out and you establish a colony somewhere where you can get that resource, and you then are able to exploit that colony and its natural resources to provide the thing that you would otherwise have to import. Another way to do that would be through war. Like if your neighbor has a huge deposit of coal or oil or some other iron ore, you just march in there and you go to war with them, you beat them, you seize those reserves, and now all of a sudden you don't have to import that anymore because you've just taken that territory. Those resources are now yours. Okay? I've already said that this is most associated with European nations before 1800, and Adam Smith will be sort of the definitive author of capitalism. Will really capitalism is written in a way to defend economy against this whole mercantilist idea. All right. Um, as this gets into now, we can see how these pieces begin to fit together. The British have to pay for all this debt. They're going to enforce mercantilist policies, and so those mercantilist policies emerge as what many of you may remember from your studies in American history. The Acts, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Navigation Acts, the Tea Act. All of those things are part of an enforcement of mercantilist policies to make sure that the wealth in the British Empire now, not just England, not just Great Britain, but within the British Empire, that wealth is maintained. It's very interesting. The British even did this during the Great Depression. They kind of doubled down on their own empire. Actually worked a little bit more in the 1920s and 30s, and even the 40s than it did in the 1760s and 70s. But it's the same idea. So they put every time you do a legal document, you have to pay a fee. That's the Stamp Act. Every time you there's a small tax on sugar, it's an excise tax. It's a tax on a specific commodity. We talk about sales taxes today. They didn't have a general sales tax that you pay on everything. This is what's called an excise tax. It's tax on a specific commodity that's at a higher rate. That would be like there's taxes today on tobacco products and alcohol products. Those are excise taxes specific to those commodities. That's what the Sugar Act was. The Navigation Act says you can only use British shipping. You cannot negotiate a lower rate with a French merchant or a Spanish merchant or a Dutch merchant to haul your goods somewhere. So merchants had to only deal with British shippers. And then therefore British shippers knew that they had a monopoly on shipping. They could charge whatever rate they wanted. So you were going to get patted down by that British shipping company. That's like us saying today, you could only use the U.S. Postal Service. You cannot use UPS. You cannot use, what's the other one? You can't use any of those, right? You just have to use the Postal Service. That's it, period, end of subject. And then the Postal Service can go and charge you whatever they want. Okay? The Tea Act was part of that. You had to buy tea, not through the Dutch East India Company or any French company or whatever. You had to buy it from the British East India Company, period, end of subject. And you had to pay the the tax on it when the tea comes off the boat. So it's the local merchant who has their tea shop that has to pay that tax right away and not wait until customers actually buy it. So it's a tax that's paid in advance. That, of course, we all know. People up in Boston did not like that. They dressed up as Native Americans and they threw the tea overboard, and that was the Boston Tea Party. Okay, right? That part of a response to the British enforcement of mercantilist policies. There are other pieces of legislation, like the Proclamation of 1763. That said that Native American colonists could not settle west of the Allegheny Mountains, the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, so all that new territory that was won as a result of the French and Indian War between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, none of that could be settled by American colonists. Now, the British did this because they wanted to avoid conflicts with Native Americans. They did not want to have to send troops out there. They didn't want to have to build fortresses out there to protect American colonists. The colonists didn't really care. They wanted those new lands. They felt that they were being boxed in on the Atlantic seaboard, that in order for the colonies to grow, to get new farmland, they needed that new land. That's what the point of the war was. They wanted to move out there. The British government said, no, it's going to be too expensive. The colonists said, no, we want it. The British said, well, we're going to have to raise your taxes in order to do that, to pay for the armies and the military installations and everything. The colonists said, we're not paying taxes either. So this is one of those instances where, in my own opinion, right, the colonists wanted their cake and they wanted to eat it too. They wanted the expansionist policy, but they did not want to have to pay for the bill that comes with all of that, which is, all the necessary protections that the British government would have to provide. Right? So that's one of those points where I think that my opinion is the colonists were sort of kind of being little crybabies there, but whatever. Eventually, the British government just did something that really infuriated the colonists. Each colony, like Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, claimed territory all the way out to the Mississippi River. Okay, you could sort of imagine Virginia continuing its colonial claims off much further west than where Virginia is today, or Pennsylvania, same thing. The British government ended that, and they extended the Canadian province of Quebec down to the Ohio River, thereby blocking Pennsylvania, Virginia, Massachusetts, and so forth from having any territories in the West. So it kind of ended the whole idea that these colonies could even expand. That infuriates the colonists. And then finally, you have the Quartering Act, which is whereby the British government could actually require private citizens to house a soldier in their house, so that the British government would not have to build barracks and would not have to pay for, let's say, feeding that soldier. So all of a sudden, hey, surprise, welcome. This, British Grenadier is going to be living with you for an indefinite period of time. Yeah, that's also going to be a very controversial piece there, and we can see how that is reflected even in the American Bill of Rights is a response to many of the types of policies that the British government had instituted prior to the Revolutionary War. The right to bear arms, the Second Amendment, is because the British went after the American colonists' ability to have firearms. That's how the whole battles of Lexington and Concord began. The British were going out to seize stores of weapons in Concord, Massachusetts, so the colonists couldn't get them, and that's when they encountered the militias at Lexington. Okay, so all of this stuff should be kind of vaguely familiar, but we can see how it now tries to fit into a much larger sort of global British imperial context that you might not have seen before. All right. I know that was very quick. You can watch that again if you need to. But the next step here is you will take a short quiz based on this. I will upload the PowerPoint and you'll have the quiz material. It's pretty simple. Just to get the quiz in before the period is out. And then there'll be a little discussion forum piece that you can reflect upon. Okay? All right. Thanks, everybody.